Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reserve Seating. I'm very excited to have special guests with us, Patrick Bromley and Heather Wixson, the co-authors of a great new book called In Search of Darkness, the definitive look at 80s horror. And they're our great friends. So I was just like, what better opportunity to get them to come on and just have like a chat about 80s horror than this opportunity? That didn't work. Hello, everybody. See, Heather, I didn't mean anything personally because hello, everybody. Welcome to Reserve Seating. I'm very excited for us to have, no. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reserve Seating. Why didn't you see The Fall Guy? F this movie starts now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Reserve Seating. We are joined by special guests Heather Wixson and Patrick Bromley today, the co-authors of In Search of Darkness, the definitive look at 80s horror. And we're here to talk about all things 80s horror. So I love this book. It's wonderful. You guys just did a signing about it in LA. How did that go?
Awful. It was terrible.
Really?
It was literally the worst experience of my entire life. No, it was weird and surreal, and 10-year-old me doesn't believe that it actually happened.
Yeah.
And I was just so grateful that because it was in LA that Patrick could be there, Derek could be there, our publisher Michael was there. It really this was we went through it on this book, and it was really nice to be able to be all together to celebrate it.
Mm.
Um, even though I still don't feel like I don't really feel like there's actually a book. I'm looking at the book. I don't believe it actually exists. So
When Heather says 10-year-old me can't believe it, it's because she's part of a body swap. And there is actually a 10-year-old version of her out there who does not believe that this book exists.
What's the process like, as someone who's never written a book? What's the process like, especially working together? Like, you guys are obviously such great friends, and you have so much of a storehouse of experience together, recording podcasts together and stuff like that. Where do you Did you guys outline the book together first, or can you kind of give me some insight into what that process is like working with as co-authors?
yeah, I think this was a little different because we were kind of already working in somebody else's sandbox.
Right.
In respect of in terms of what the documentary did. So when this started to come together, I had the publisher reach out, and they made the deal with the In Search of Darkness folks. We knew we were going to be tackling the movies from documentary 1 and 2. 3 hadn't gone into production yet, and so we kind of just knew we were already working on those 142 movies. And then as we were kind of figuring out what exactly this book was going to be, it became extremely apparent that I couldn't do this by myself, because doing it with another person was already it was a lot of stress, I think, for both of us, just trying to juggle everything that we have going on. And so when they asked me oh, if we're going to bring in another writer, who do you want? And I was like, well, there's only one person I'm going to ask for, and it's Patrick. And I think what a lot of that is obviously because we're friends, but I also think because we have very complementary sort of views of horror, but not in a way that overlaps a lot. There's a lot of movies I could have written about, but I wanted Patrick to take them more so like the Fulcis and the Stuart Gordon movies, because I knew his love and appreciation for those movies was a little different than mine. And I think you can see that in the chapters that we wrote. I'm kind of a stick in the mud sometimes, so I got a little more on the factual side, I think, where I love Patrick's chapters because they feel like conversations that are informative. But I also, there's certain lines where I'm I read it and I hear Patrick's voice. So I think by having those two styles, where it just didn't feel like the same thing over and over and over again. So yeah, so and then basically we went through and just kind of we knew the movies we were going to do, and then I kind of just divvied them up between us in terms of what I knew our strengths were. I think there's only one movie I just knew I didn't want to do, just from a mental health perspective, and that was Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer. It's a great movie. I never want to watch it again. It isn't my bag, and so I appreciated Patrick taking that one on like a champ. He also took Tetsuo over because I was really intimidated.
I remember the text that Patrick was sending me when he was watching that. And
I was
also
like,
on Henry, Heather, I agree with you. I watched it one time because I felt like as a horror fan, I owed it one watch. And it's one of the few movies where I immediately put it back in the Netflix envelope and mailed it right after I watched it because I'm just like, I want no part of this. This needs to leave my home. Was there any movie in particular, or, more than one movie for each of you that kind of grew in your appreciation by watching it again and writing about it for the purpose of the book?
So the one for me, I think I mentioned this somewhere else, but I had never seen Russell Mulcahy's Razorback.
Mhm.
There were only a handful of like first time watches for me, and maybe 3 or 4. And honestly, those 3 or 4 were mostly like I had avoided them for a reason, and I watched them and I was like, I get it, but also I don't get it.
Sure.
But Razorback I had just never seen, and I was like, oh, this movie is awesome. I really, really dug Razorback. I would say, I mean, every movie that we wrote about, at least for me, went up in my estimation a little bit because I learned about how it was made and I
Mhm.
just became a scholar of that movie. And as soon as you know that much about something, you start to appreciate it. But
Yeah.
Razorback was the one that jumped out in terms of like a first time watch that I really loved.
I think for me, probably the one that I ended up coming out liking more. I still don't love it, but I definitely liked it more was 976 Evil. And I
Mhm.
think it's because knowing, I mean, one, it was just no money, so quick. Robert Englund's ideas were far too big for the budget he had to work with. But he had some really great talent put together for that film. So there are things about it that I do like a lot more. And I think also too, because of knowing now, like what I know about like his appreciation for like art and literature and history and that kind of stuff. And like you see it peppered into this like scuzzy little movie about like demons and weird phone numbers. I definitely liked it more in that regard where I'm just like, oh, okay. So Robert was really just trying to like do Dante's Inferno with like his interpretation. Like, so it was like, it was
Of
interesting.
course
It's
he
not a movie I would
was.
have, I know, right? Of course Robert was doing that. He's Robert Englund.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that one for me was just kind of like, oh, okay, because that was a movie. Seeing as a kid, I was so disappointed in, because it was Robert Englund directing, Stephen Jeffries in it. It's a horror movie. Like that should have been like a home run for me as a kid, and I walked out really disappointed. And so it's definitely gotten better for me.
So, do you have an 80s deep cut horror recommendation for our viewers? Is there one that like you think is totally underrated or totally underseen that you really kind of want to use? I was going to say this platform, but that sounds way too formal. This video to really kind of try to encourage people to seek out.
I think for me, one that's like I is underappreciated, but it has gotten appreciation lately. And it's one that we didn't actually get to write about for the book, which bummed me out. But it's Spookies because
Love
I
spooky.
love like
Talking to the
kitchen
right
sink
man.
horror,
Yeah.
right? Yes, it's like kitchen sink horror done right. It's obviously like two movies sort of cobbled together because of circumstances. But I got to hear like a lot of like the behind the scenes stories on that movie from like special effects folks.
Mhm.
And it's the experiences making that movie were as batshit as the movie is. Um, and so it fits the energy of the movie perfectly. And I love the fact that it's like just a cavalcade of like creatures, almost sort of like as a precursor to Waxwork in a lot of ways. And yeah, it's just one of those movies like I don't know that everybody will ever love Spookies, and I'm okay if they don't, but everybody who's a horror fan should at least see Spookies once.
I was expecting it to be funny, like so bad it's good funny, and I found it like really unsettling. Like the way that it's put together just seems so out of left field and alien that like it has this vibe to it that is quite frankly just spooky.
I'll do one that I wrote about in the book, and that is an Empire picture called Cellar Dweller, directed
Hmm.
by John Carl Buechler. Jeffrey Combs has a very small part. I even referenced Corman's Calamity in there just for you, Adam, because it's about people who are drawing comics that then come to life, including a monster, the titular cellar dweller, which is a really cool monster that John Carl Buechler designed. Brian Robbins has a small role, and who knew he would go on to be the CEO of Paramount. It's like 75 minutes long. It's got a cool monster in it. Yvonne DiCarlo shows up in her elder years. It's just really, really, for lack of a better word, fun. Like, it's a fun monster movie. I obviously have a soft spot for all things Empire / Full Moon. And this is one of the good ones that not everyone has seen. When you talk about like Empire horror movies, there's like 4 or 5 that people will go to. A lot of the Stuart Gordons and like Terror Vision, those kinds of movies. Cellar Dweller doesn't usually come up, so I was actually really excited to see it on the list of movies that we were going to cover for the book, because it was a chance to champion a movie that not enough people have seen.
Because you both have had the experience of writing a book, do you think you're better than us? No. No. What I was going to ask was, because the 80s are so important to you becoming a horror fan, do you think you're better than us? Do you remember what horror movies or television shows from the 80s were your gateway drugs to becoming horror fans?
For me, it was monster books that I used to check out from the library, the Crestwood House books. It was the original Creepshow. It was Tales from the Crypt. It was Freddy's Nightmares. It was someone describing the plot of A Nightmare on Elm Street to me before I ever got to see it. It was the poster for House, the original House. So many things like fueled my love of horror, but that's a few.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Crestwood books, because those were I repeatedly checked those out of the library as a kid. And then of course went on to like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which was, way to sort of push my buttons a little bit. I think I kind of grew up in I'm it's one of those things where I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm too old for things and stuff like that. But I realized like I grew up at the perfect time, because there's not a lot I would change. And I grew up in a house with a single mom. And so because of just economics, like I just went to stuff with her. So from age 3 on, like if she wanted to go see a horror movie, most of the time I just went with her. And that kind of threw me in the deep end really quick. And so I think one of my first like movies that I was obsessed with, I think was actually, and it's funny because we do the Hang On with Toby Hooper, but I think it was Salem's Lot, because we saw that like, and of course it's 79, so it doesn't quite fit 80s. But it was sort of my real first introduction into vampires. And I knew there was something about them that I really wanted to know more about. And I started checking out books on Vlad the Impaler and like anything and everything with Dracula, like I had to consume. And then a few years later after that was, of course, the introduction of Freddy Krueger, who scared the big crap out of me, but I couldn't get enough. And then eventually wanted to put a poster of him on my wall like a weirdo. I don't know why, like, I don't know why any kid would want to do that from something. I mean, I was still scared of him at that point, but I was like, I need a poster. I don't know why. So him and Hulk Hogan became friends on my wall, along with the Coreys, because I had a Corey's wall. From Bop and Teen Beat, kids, those were magazines back in the day.
Magazines were like paper internet, kids.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I think I was just lucky that I grew up with the access to the things that I did. Like, my mom didn't really tell me like I couldn't watch stuff. My best friend, who I spent a lot of time at her house, her parents were super into like sci-fi horror. So I spent a lot of time watching a lot of that stuff over there, as well as all the Star Trek movies. So yeah, it was just having that door open for me, and being open to it all. I think that made me really lucky to be able to embrace so many different things. And like that's what's really cool. Like when I look at like 80s horror, and I was trying to like break down 90s horror just for funsies, and I was looking at sort of the diversity of 80s versus the diversity of 90s, and there's still a pretty good amount, but like you just look at the things that were going on in the studios, and then you look at like, for example, we're going to go talk Life Force and space vampires and things like that. Like nobody's making movies about space vampires these days. They should be. We should be well into like a trilogy of space vampire movies at this point. A24, if you're listening, please call me. So like it's just it really was a time where anybody who was just loved movies in general could actually find something that they were going to enjoy, because there was everything.
That actually leads me to the question I was going to ask before, which is the book is very specifically about 80s horror. And if you were to pick another decade to write a similar book about, what will be another definitive decade in horror that you think would be worth all the arduous effort that you guys put into this one? Or is there?
Do you have
I would do the 90s only because I think the 90s gets a bad rap.
Okay.
Yes. I,
And it would be fun to revisit those movies, but also to sort of reclaim. And I know that there's people working on 90s horror projects right now, so the reclamation is already well underway.
Right.
But there's this idea that like after 1990 the genre died until Scream, and that's just not the case.
All right, so final question for you both. If I had to give you the difficult task of picking your favorite or the best 80s horror movie, or you could answer it this way, the 80s horror movie that you think best encapsulates that decade of horror, what would you pick?
I think when you watch 80s horror, there's like a very specific like aesthetic and approach, and soundtrack was so key, and energy. And do I think that this is the best horror movie of the 1980s? I do not. But when I think about the most quintessential 80s horror movie, to me, it's weird because this is going to be probably controversial, not what you guys are going to think I'm going to say. I would actually go with The Lost Boys, because I think for me it encapsulates sort of like the youth drive of horror throughout the decades. Fantastic soundtrack, really great visual style, brings something new to the table in terms of the creatures that are at the center of it. Endlessly quotable, really enjoyable. It's like one of those movies, like it just doesn't miss. So for me, I think that like I think there's greater horror movies, but I think that's like the horror movie of the 1980s.
For me, it's A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's my favorite horror movie. It's a lot of what was unique about the 80s, whether it was the introduction of certain kinds of practical special effects, whether it's, like Heather said, the use of teenage protagonists, the creation of new icons for the first time, really, since the 1930s or so. It's a riff on the slasher formula that had already been established, but we're doing something different with it. It combines imagination and creativity in a way with its horror elements and surrealism, and it does everything right until it pulls Ronnie Blakely through a tiny window at the end of the movie.
I don't really have an answer for my favorite or best, but like when I was thinking of what screams 80s horror to me the most, not picking, I think Patrick and Heather's choices were great and would be in my short list. I keep thinking Fright Night, because it like combines like sort of the affection for the past horror, the horror host aesthetic, practical effects. Vampires were huge in the 80s, so it kind of combines everything. So before we leave, please tell us where we can pick up the book, and Heather, please tell us where we can read and hear you on the internet.
I'll do the first part. If you go to amikpublishing.com, AMINK publishing.com, you can still order the book. It was a limited run of the deluxe edition coffee table book. According to Heather, there's maybe only about 200 left. 100 left?
Like a little under 200, I
A
believe.
little under 200. So you want to jump on that. We're hoping to do a paperback version sometime in the future if this sells out. But right now, the best way to get it is directly from the publisher.
And in terms of like, I mean, I'm kind of sort of semi-retired these days. So I'm not over at Daily Dead these days, but you should go over to Daily Dead anyway, just for funsies. Because they've got good folks over there. In fact, Derek, who is our editor on the book, he's over there doing a lot of the junkets and stuff. Now they grow up so fast. But you can just find me on all social media at the Horror Chick. I do have this book, Working on Monsters, Makeup, and Effects, Volume 3. Also been working sort of in the realm of like special features for different releases. So I recently got to celebrate an essay for Brandon Cronenberg's Possessor. Just got hired to be a curator for some special features for an upcoming 4K release I can't talk about yet, which is pretty cool. And I've got a bunch of other essay announcements that I'm just waiting for people to make. But yeah, lots of good stuff out there.
So we will be back next week. We're picking up Adam Month midstream. So hopefully I chose a movie that I still like. So it is Alita Battle Angel, the collaboration of Robert Rodriguez and James Cameron. And we are going to be joined by special guests Mark On and Adam Foss. So until next time.
Till next time, watch 8 Heartbeats.